Ever felt like you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and suddenly everyone's pointing a finger at you for something you didn't even do? That feeling of being blamed for something that isn't your fault cuts deep, and that's exactly what's happening right now. It's like being accused of breaking a window when you weren't even in the room. And the person pointing the finger? Well, they're not exactly in a position to judge because they're not royals anymore, and Victoria is completely broke. So why should hardworking people's money be used to pay for their security when they've made it clear they don't want to be part of the royal family? The British Parliament just made a huge decision that's sending shockwaves through the entire country. They actually voted to strip Meghan of her Sussex title. This isn't just another rumor you'd read in a gossip magazine, and it's not some leaked secret from a palace insider. This was a real, actual vote that happened in the halls of Parliament. Palace insiders, who are usually very careful with their words, have confirmed that this was treated as an emergency measure, and it moved way faster than anyone expected. When things move this quickly in the world of royalty, you know something serious has happened behind those palace walls that we haven't been told about. And King Charles? Sources close to him say he didn't step in to stop it. Some people think he couldn't have stopped it even if he wanted to, while others believe he simply chose not to. But here's the part that will send chills down your spine. It's not the vote itself that's the most shocking part of this whole story. It's what caused it to happen in the first place. And once that truth comes out, and trust me, it will, everything we thought we knew about the royal family is going to change forever. So stick around because you really need to hear this story. Nobody saw this coming, and I mean absolutely nobody, not even the people who have been asking for this to happen for years. When the news broke that Parliament was rushing through an emergency measure to target Meghan's Sussex title, the political world just went quiet for a moment. You could have heard a pin drop, and then it was like someone lit a firecracker in a room full of people. Journalists were running around like crazy trying to get the story straight. Royal commentators who usually have everything planned out had to clear their schedules because this was huge. Phones inside Buckingham Palace reportedly didn't stop ringing all day and all night. This wasn't just some petition that people signed online, and it wasn't a headline made up by a tabloid to sell newspapers. No, this was the actual British government, the machinery of democracy, moving quickly and deliberately against someone who was once a member of the royal family. And the people inside Westminster who watched this happen say the feeling in those hallways was something they hadn't experienced in years. There was a sense of urgency in the air, a lot of tension, and underneath all of that, there was this strange feeling that this was somehow inevitable, like it was always going to end up this way. So, what actually happened? Let me break it down for you. A formal motion was put forward in the House of Commons calling for Meghan's Duchess of Sussex title to be removed. The measure was labeled as urgent, and that label alone sent shockwaves through Westminster. Urgent measures are extremely rare in British politics. They only happen when lawmakers believe that the situation is so serious that it simply cannot wait for the normal, slow process of making laws. This motion didn't just appear out of thin air. It had actually been building quietly behind closed doors for much longer than most people realize. The members of parliament who pushed this forward had been watching and waiting for the perfect moment to act. They were patient, they were organized, and when the moment finally arrived, they moved with a speed that stunned even their own colleagues on the floor of parliament. Now, here's where things get really interesting. To strip a royal title, especially a dukedom like Sussex, you can't just snap your fingers and make it happen. Even the king himself can't do it alone. The legal system of the British monarchy means that titles given through letters pat require an act of parliament to be formally removed. This isn't a simple signature on a piece of paper. It requires votes, debates, and a whole lot of political will. And that's exactly what makes this moment so extraordinary. For Parliament to move this fast, classifying it as an emergency, it means that behind the scenes there's a level of agreement that the public hasn't been told about yet. Someone did the math before this motion was ever read aloud. Someone knew they had the numbers, and that someone made sure everything was in place before the doors even opened. Who exactly pushed this forward? That's the question everybody in Westminster is asking right now. The names attached to this motion represent a mix of parliament, not just one political party or one group. Multiple voices from different political corners all arrived at the same conclusion at the same time. In a parliament that can barely agree on what to have for lunch, they found agreement on this. That alone should tell you something very important. Now, think about the timing carefully. This motion wasn't introduced during a quiet news week or a slow political moment when someone was just looking for attention. No, it landed right in the middle of an already turbulent period for the monarchy. When the royal family could least afford another crisis, when their name was already being dragged through the headlines, When the whole situation was already drawing uncomfortable attention from the press and the public, someone chose this exact moment to act. And that raises the first question that this story just won't let go of. Was the timing a coincidence, or was someone inside the establishment, someone sitting very close to the top, quietly giving this the green light from the shadows? Because here's what royal insiders are saying behind closed doors. The speed of this measure suggests prior coordination that goes far beyond what Parliament is admitting publicly. Bills classified as urgent in Westminster don't just appear overnight. They require groundwork, conversations, and back-channel agreements that never make it into official statements. That means somebody knew this was coming long before it was announced, and that somebody may not be sitting in Parliament at all. We'll come back to that because the name that keeps coming up in those private conversations is one that will genuinely stop you in your tracks. But first, let's talk about the legal mechanics because understanding how this works is what makes the whole thing so staggering. As things currently stand, removing a dukedom requires legislative action through a full act of parliament. That process is slow by design. British constitutional law doesn't encourage hasty decisions around titles and honors. Most titles are awarded under the royal prerogative, meaning their legal foundation rests not in legislation, but in powers that the courts recognize as belonging to the monarch alone. So, for Parliament to bypass that system and move directly at emergency speed isn't just unusual. It's almost without modern precedent when it comes to a sitting duchess. The closest comparison anyone can draw is Prince Andrew, whose titles became the subject of a formal removal process in late 2025. But that process took months of public pressure and complete disaster for his reputation before it gathered any momentum at all. What's happening with Meghan is moving considerably faster, and the speed is telling a story that no official statement is willing to tell out loud. Because here's the truth about emergency measures in Parliament. They don't get declared unless somebody with real influence has already done the counting, secured the votes, and cleared the path. This isn't a beginning. This is an ending. Something happened. Something shifted. Some line was crossed, or some information surfaced that transformed this from a fringe political demand into an urgent parliamentary measure almost overnight. What was that thing? Stick with us because that answer is coming, and it's far more explosive than anything you've read in the papers. Every political explosion has a fuse. The question is never really about the explosion itself. It's always about what lit it and how long it had been burning before anyone noticed. And in this case, the fuse had been burning for a very long time indeed. To understand what triggered this parliamentary move, you have to go back further than the headlines. You have to look at the pattern because what happened in Westminster wasn't a reaction to one single event. It was the result of a slow and steady buildup of moments that finally pushed the patience of the British establishment past its breaking point. Let's start with what most people already know. Harry and Meghan stepped away from senior royal duties in early 2020. They moved to California. They gave interviews. They signed deals with Netflix and Spotify worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They told their story publicly and repeatedly in ways that left the royal family with very little ability to respond. That much is documented history. But here's where the story takes a turn that the mainstream coverage has largely glossed over. It wasn't the departure itself that caused the deepest damage inside the institution. Plenty of royals have stepped back over the decades. What made this different was the ongoing nature of what followed. The interviews didn't stop. The commentary didn't slow down. And with every passing month, the gap between what the palace wanted to project and what the Sussexes were saying in public grew wider and more difficult to manage. Sources close to the palace have described the atmosphere inside the institution over the past 2 years as one of controlled frustration. Controlled because there was a deliberate effort from the top to avoid public confrontation. Frustration because behind the scenes, certain developments were landing like grenades in very quiet rooms. And one of those developments in particular is the one that nobody in the official press briefings wants to name directly. So, what was it? What finally moved this from frustration to formal parliamentary action? There are several threads worth pulling. The first is Meghan's increasingly public positioning of herself as a brand, not just in entertainment, but in areas that touch on politics, advocacy, and international diplomacy. Her activities in the United States have drawn attention from observers on both sides of the Atlantic, who note that she's been operating in spaces that carry significant weight and visibility. The second thread is harder to pin down, but impossible to ignore if you speak to anyone with genuine access to Westminster thinking. There's a growing belief among certain lawmakers that the Sussex name carrying as it does the weight of a British royal title, is being used in contexts that create diplomatic and reputational problems for the crown. Not through any single act, but through a pattern of activity that, when viewed as a whole, raises serious questions about whether the title should continue to attach itself to that pattern. The lawmakers who filed this motion had been in communication with figures who track Sussex activities very closely, and those figures aren't all outside the palace walls. Some of them, according to sources, are very much inside. Think about what that means for a moment. It means this wasn't Parliament acting alone. It means there were conversations happening in rooms we don't have access to, between people who carry enormous institutional weight about whether the time had come to act. And at some point in those conversations, someone said, yes, the time has come. In the months leading up to the parliamentary motion, Meghan had been involved in a series of public moves that generated controversy on a scale that surprised even her most vocal critics. Her media appearances shifted in tone. Her public statements became sharper and more pointed. And in at least one instance, something she said or did in a very public setting landed with enough force to prompt urgent conversations in places where urgent conversations almost never happen. We're being deliberately careful here because the full details of that particular moment are still emerging. What we can tell you is that the people who were in those conversations described the reaction as swift and serious. Words like unacceptable were used. Phrases like this cannot continue came up more than once. And within weeks of that moment, the parliamentary motion began taking shape behind closed doors. So let's be precise about what the trigger actually was. It wasn't one thing. It was the accumulation of everything layered on top of one final moment that made the cost of inaction feel greater than the cost of acting. That's how these decisions get made in British political life, not in a flash of anger, but in a quiet room after a long calculation. When the people with the power to act finally decide that waiting is no longer an option. And here's what makes this particularly fascinating from a constitutional standpoint. The legal route being used to advance this measure isn't the one most commentators initially expected. Earlier attempts to legislate around royal title removal, including the bill proposed by Conservative MP Bob Seely in previous parliamentary sessions, had stalled and lapsed without completing the necessary stages. Those earlier efforts lacked government sponsorship and cross-party support. They were easy to dismiss and easier to delay. This time is different. This time the motion carries a weight in a coalition that earlier proposals simply didn't have. This time, there are voices across the chamber lending their support in ways that suggest the political calculation has fundamentally shifted. What changed that calculation? What made this the moment rather than all the moments before it? That question leads us somewhere that most people covering this story haven't yet been willing to go. It leads us inside the palace itself. And what's there will genuinely take your breath away. There's a particular kind of silence that speaks louder than any statement. It's the silence of people who know exactly what's happening and have made a very deliberate choice to say nothing about it. That's the silence that's been coming from Buckingham Palace since this parliamentary measure began its journey through Westminster. And for those who understand how the palace operates, that silence isn't neutral. It's a message. Let's be very clear about something from the start. The royal family has mechanisms for stopping things they don't want to happen. They have advisors, legal teams, press secretaries, and back-channel relationships with lawmakers that stretch back generations. When the palace wants something killed quietly, it rarely makes it to the front pages. The fact that this motion not only survived but accelerated tells you everything you need to know about whether the palace truly wanted it stopped. So why the silence? There are two schools of thought among royal watchers and constitutional experts who have been following this situation closely. The first school says the palace is staying quiet because it has no legal standing to intervene in a parliamentary process, and intervening publicly would only make the situation more chaotic. That argument is clean and makes sense on the surface, but it doesn't hold up when you look at the history of how the palace has handled uncomfortable legislation in the past. The second school of thought is far more unsettling. It holds that the palace is silent not because it can't speak, but because it doesn't want to. That certain figures inside the institution looked at this parliamentary motion, weighed the consequences of stopping it against the consequences of letting it run, and made a quiet decision to step back and allow events to unfold. If that's true, and the evidence is beginning to point uncomfortably in that direction, then what we're witnessing isn't Parliament acting against the wishes of the Crown. It's something far more calculated than that. Now let's talk about Charles, because the King's position in all of this is the central mystery that this story keeps circling. On the surface, Charles has maintained his posture of dignified silence on all matters Sussex related for several years now. His public statements have been carefully worded to project an image of a father who hasn't given up hope of reconciliation, while simultaneously running an institution that has steadily distanced itself from his youngest son and daughter in law. That balancing act has been one of the defining tensions of his reign so far. But sources who have spoken to people in Charles's inner circle describe a private reality that looks quite different from the public posture. The patience, they say, has been wearing thin for longer than most people outside the palace realize. Certain developments over the past year in particular have landed badly with the king personally, not just institutionally, but personally. And when things land badly with Charles on a personal level, the people around him know to watch for the quiet signals that follow. The subtle shifts in tone, the changes in who gets access to whom, the decisions that get made without announcements. Those quiet signals, according to sources, began appearing some months before the parliamentary motion was tabled. People who monitor palace dynamics closely noticed changes in how certain conversations were being handled. Topics that had previously been approached with careful neutrality began to be addressed with something that felt closer to resolution, as though decisions that had been deferred for years were finally being quietly arrived at behind closed doors. And then there's William, because you can't tell this story honestly without talking about the Prince of Wales and what his position actually is in all of this. William has been the subject of significant speculation ever since reports emerged that he had made clear in private that he had no intention of restoring the Sussexes to any formal role within the monarchy. Those reports were never officially confirmed and never officially denied, which in palace terms is as close to a confirmation as you're likely to get. People familiar with William's thinking describe someone who's moved through grief and anger into something that looks more like finality. He's not consumed by the Sussex situation the way the early years of the split might have suggested he would be. He's built his own path, his own platform, and his own vision for what the monarchy should look like when his time comes. And in that vision, according to those who know him well, the Sussex title continuing to operate as it currently does simply doesn't fit. The palace didn't stop this because the palace at its highest levels didn't want it stopped. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's just how the British establishment has always operated. Quietly, deliberately, with complete deniability. But here's the question that will keep you thinking long after this video is over. If the palace was willing to allow this to happen to Meghan, what does that tell us about Harry's position? Because the Sussex title belongs to both of them. You can't surgically remove it from one without the question immediately arising about the other. And the people pushing this measure in Parliament aren't known for doing things halfway, which raises a possibility that, until very recently, felt unthinkable. Is Harry next? And does he already know it? She's been here before. Not exactly here, not with Parliament voting on her title in an emergency session. But Meghan Markle has stood at the edge of institutional collapse before and walked away standing. She knows what it feels like when the walls close in. She knows what it feels like when the people who were supposed to protect you decide to look the other way. And if there's one thing that everyone across both sides of this debate seems to agree on, it's that Meghan doesn't go quietly. So the moment word began spreading about the parliamentary motion, something shifted inside the Sussex camp in Montecito. Sources close to the couple described the initial reaction as a mix of disbelief and cold fury. Disbelief because even those who had been watching the political temperature rise didn't expect it to move this fast. Cold fury because this felt to those inside the inner circle like a coordinated attack dressed up in the language of constitutional process. And Meghan, by all accounts, wasn't prepared to sit still and absorb it. Within hours of the news breaking, her team was already in motion. Calls were made, lawyers were briefed, and a communication strategy began taking shape with a speed that surprised even some of the people involved in putting it together. Because this wasn't a team caught flat-footed. This was a team that had been operating in crisis mode for long enough to have a muscle memory for exactly this kind of moment. The question wasn't whether they would respond. The question was how and in which direction they would aim. Let's start with the legal dimension because it's where the most immediate and concrete battle lines are being drawn. Removing a dukedom through an act of parliament isn't a straightforward process. It's slow, it's complicated, and it's vulnerable to legal challenge at multiple points along the way. Meghan's legal team is understood to be examining every stage of the process for procedural vulnerabilities, every precedent, every constitutional argument that could be deployed to slow the measure down, complicate its passage, or challenge its legitimacy in court if it comes to that. And there's genuine legal ground to stand on here. Constitutional lawyers who have been asked about this publicly and privately point to the complexity of stripping a title from someone who acquired it through marriage rather than birth. The legal questions around what exactly is being removed, what rights attach to the title, and what process is required to remove those rights cleanly aren't simple questions. They're the kind of questions that can keep courts busy for a very long time, which may, of course, be precisely the point of raising them. Beyond the legal strategy, there's the public strategy. And this is where Meghan's approach becomes genuinely fascinating to watch because it's not what most people expected. The assumption among many commentators was that she would come out swinging publicly, that there would be a statement, an interview, perhaps a carefully timed media appearance designed to shift the narrative and generate sympathy. That's the playbook her critics have always accused her of following. But that's not what happened, at least not initially. Instead, the response from the Sussex camp has been something closer to strategic restraint. Carefully worded statements from representatives, a deliberate effort to keep Meghan herself out of the direct line of fire, while the legal and communications teams do their work in the background. It's a more disciplined approach than many expected, and it speaks to a level of strategic thinking that her detractors consistently underestimate. There's a reason for the restraint, and it's not simply tactical. It's personal. Because at the center of all of this, underneath the legal arguments and the communication strategy and the political maneuvering, there's a woman who's watching an institution that was once part of her life try to erase one of the most significant things it ever gave her. The Sussex title isn't just a legal designation for Meghan. She said publicly that Sussex is her family name. It's the name her children carry. It's woven into the identity she's built since leaving the working royal life behind. To have it removed isn't just a political or legal event. It's deeply and viscerally personal. And that personal dimension is shaping every decision her team is making right now. Because the risk of fighting too publicly is that it looks like vanity, like a woman clinging to a title for status rather than substance. And the risk of fighting too quietly is that it looks like acceptance, like surrender. Neither of those optics serves her. So the team is threading a needle that requires extraordinary precision at a moment when the pressure to make a mistake has never been higher. Now let's talk about Harry because his role in all of this is the subplot that everyone's watching and nobody's discussing loudly enough. The Sussex title is his title too. His dukedom, his name as much as hers. And yet, the public signals coming from his direction have been notably muted in ways that are beginning to raise serious questions among people who follow this situation closely. There are two ways to read Harry's silence. The first and more charitable reading is that he's standing firmly behind Meghan, coordinating with her team, and simply choosing not to be a visible face in the public response, because the situation calls for a unified but measured approach. That reading casts him as a supportive partner, operating strategically rather than emotionally. The second reading is considerably darker, and it's the one that sources in certain circles are beginning to whisper about. That Harry's silence isn't strategic coordination, but distance. That the events of the past year have placed strains on the Sussex partnership that go deeper than the public image of a united front would suggest. That Harry, who's never fully closed the door on his relationship with his family or his country, finds himself in a position where fighting loudly for the Sussex title puts him in direct conflict with an institution he still has complicated feelings about. People who have spoken to those in Harry's orbit describe someone who's genuinely torn. He loves Meghan. That doesn't appear to be in question. But love and alignment aren't always the same thing. And there are people close to him who believe that his heart on this particular issue is more divided than anyone on the outside is currently being allowed to see. The question of whether he truly wants to spend the next phase of his life in a public war with Parliament and the palace over a title is one that those close to him say he hasn't fully resolved. The fracture that this situation is exposing isn't just between the Sussexes and the institution. It may be a fracture within the Sussex partnership itself. Not a collapse, not a crisis of the marriage in any simple sense, but a divergence of interest and instinct at a moment when perfect unity is the only thing that gives their position any real strength. If Harry is wavering, even privately, even slightly, the people on the other side of this fight will sense it. The British establishment has a centuries-old instinct for exactly that kind of weakness, and they will use it quietly, deliberately, without leaving fingerprints. So what happens next for Meghan specifically? Her team is understood to be pursuing three parallel tracks simultaneously. The legal challenge is the first and most visible track, designed to slow the parliamentary process and create complications that force lawmakers to reckon with the constitutional complexity of what they're attempting. The second track is diplomatic, involving outreach to figures in public life on both sides of the Atlantic who can speak to Meghan's character and contributions in ways that shift the broader narrative around her. The third track is the most closely guarded and involves preparation for a much more significant public moment that sources say is being planned with considerable care and deliberate timing. What that public moment looks like when it lands and what it contains is something her team is holding very close. But people familiar with the planning describe it as something designed not just to respond to the parliamentary situation, but to reframe the entire conversation around who Meghan is, what she represents, and why what's being done to her matters beyond the boundaries of royal protocol and British constitutional law. Whether it works is another question entirely because the forces arranged against her right now aren't simply hostile. They're patient, they're organized, and they have the weight of an ancient institution behind them. Meghan has talent, resilience, and a global platform, but talent and resilience have limits when the machinery of the British state decides to move in one direction. And right now, that machinery is moving with a purpose and a momentum that her team knows won't be easy to slow down. The fight is real. The stakes are enormous, and the most important chapter of this story hasn't even been written yet. Now, here's where we have to step back from the drama for a moment and look at the bigger picture. Because what's happening to Meghan right now isn't just a story about one woman and one title. It's a story about the future of the British monarchy itself, about what the institution is willing to do to protect itself, about where the boundaries of royal membership actually sit in the 21st century, and about a precedent that once set can't easily be walked back. Let's start with the constitutional implications, because they're more far reaching than most of the coverage has acknowledged. If this parliamentary measure succeeds and Meghan's Sussex title is formally removed through an act of parliament, it will represent something genuinely historic. Not just because of who Meghan is or what she represents, but because of what the mechanism itself signals about the relationship between the Crown, Parliament, and the individuals who carry royal titles. It will mean that a title granted on one of the happiest days of a person's life can be legislatively stripped away when the political winds shift far enough. That's a significant thing to establish as precedent. Constitutional experts who have been consulted on this situation point to the ripple effects that could follow such a decision. Once Parliament demonstrates the appetite and the legal pathway to remove a royal title through emergency legislation, the question of who else might be vulnerable to that same process becomes impossible to avoid. The Duke of York situation, which has been grinding slowly through institutional channels since 2025, suddenly looks very different if a faster parliamentary route is proven to work. Other titles, other figures, other complicated relationships between the crown and its extended family could all find themselves newly exposed to a process that previously felt unthinkable. And then there's the question of what this does to the monarchy's global image. The royal family has spent decades carefully cultivating a reputation as an institution above petty political scores, dignified, restrained above the fray. Every time that image has taken a hit, whether through scandal or conflict or public division, the recovery has required enormous amounts of careful management and time. What's happening now has the potential to land differently in the court of global public opinion than palace advisors may be fully prepared for, particularly in the United States, where Meghan commands a level of public sympathy and cultural visibility that the British establishment consistently underestimates. The optics of an ancient institution stripping a title from a biracial American woman through emergency, parliamentary legislation won't land the same way in Los Angeles or New York as it does in Westminster. That gap in perception is something the palace will have to manage with extraordinary care if this measure completes its journey through Parliament. And so far, the signs that they're prepared for that particular battle aren't especially reassuring. Now let's bring this back to the question that Section 3 left hanging in the air. Is Harry next? Because the people advancing this measure have shown no particular interest in doing things halfway, and the logic of removing Meghan's title while leaving Harry's intact creates its own set of complications. A duchess without a duke is a constitutional oddity that raises as many questions as it answers. The cleaner resolution from a purely procedural standpoint would be to address both titles through the same process. And there are voices within the parliamentary coalition behind this motion who have made no secret of the fact that they see Harry's title as equally deserving of scrutiny. Whether that happens depends on factors that are still in motion. It depends on how the legal challenges from Meghan's team play out. It depends on how the public responds as this story develops and as more details about the trigger and the palace's role emerge. It depends on Harry himself and what decisions he makes in the coming weeks about how publicly and how forcefully he's willing to stand in the path of this process. Those decisions will define not just his immediate future, but the entire trajectory of what the Sussex story becomes from this point forward. This is the result of years of accumulated tension, of quiet decisions made in rooms we can't access, of a palace that chose silence over intervention, of a marriage under pressure that the world hasn't been allowed to see clearly, and of a constitutional system that has finally found both the will and the mechanism to act. This isn't the end of the Sussex story. It may not even be the end of this particular chapter, but nothing about the dynamic between Meghan, Harry, and the British establishment will ever look quite the same again. The ground has shifted permanently. A title under siege, a palace that chose silence, a marriage navigating pressure behind closed doors, and a constitutional precedent that could reshape the monarchy for generations. This is far from over. There are developments still coming that will make everything you just heard look like the opening.